Welcome to the last Jurisprudence Discussion Group talk of the term. And we are pleased to have here with us today Micha Gläser from the University of Zurich. And he'll be presenting his paper, Coercion as Public Incentives. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm also thankful because it forced me to actually write this paper. And those of you who had to deal with me over the last few days, meaning Crescente and Sebastian, they kind of know it's been a rush job. And I think one of the effects of it being a rush job is that the paper has what I take to be three weaknesses, kind of major weaknesses. Which one, the argument's incomplete. Two, it's incoherent in the sense that it's not entirely clear how everything hangs together. Hopefully it's not coherent sort of at the micro level of sentences not even making sense, but sort of at the kind of larger level, it's not clear how the different parts all fit into a single argument. And then third, that I think in writing, at some point, there was a kind of shift in, my starting concern is different from the concern I ended up talking about. So I don't think I'll be able to remedy all three of these defects in the talk, but I'll try to remedy at least the last two. So I'll say a bit more, try to make it a little more coherent and maybe try and bring out with the larger, maybe there is a single point there. So the two aren't entirely separate, but yeah. So in that sense, what I'll try to do now is to present the paper for you. For those of you who haven't read it, I'm just going to try to present a better version of it, a rational reconstruction of it. And for those of you who've read it, I'm going to try and undo a little bit of the damage I've done with the piece itself. Okay, so what I started out with, and this is sort of the original motivation, and it's also the first quote on the handout, is that there seems to be something, so there's this quote, this is just an illustration, but the point is, I think, applies much more widely. There seems to be something problematic, in a manner to be defined, when people obey the law just because there's a threat of coercion. And so I picked this quote from the kind of the eve of the French Revolution, where Count Mirabeau, who was one of the representatives of the tiers of the Third Estate, said, we're here by the will of the people, are only going to receive by the force of the bayonet, as opposed to simply because the king said so. Right? So there seems to be something, you might think, well, we're trying to get an understanding of what's problematic about that, or what's sort of gone wrong here, again, in a not yet specified sense of gone wrong. So one theory that I take it has quite a bit of currency in the philosophy of law. How much exactly, I'm not sure, because I know less about the literature than I probably should, as part of the papers being a rush job. Is something that that sort of comes out in Hart's, or that Hart, view that Hart defends, and I think other people hold a similar view. I think Joseph Ras holds a similar view, which is the idea that you can distinguish, there's a sort of conceptual distinction between the coerciveness of law and the authority of law. And so, sort of more specifically, those two provide, if you like, two kinds of motivations to follow the law. So one would be, people might follow the law simply because the law says so. They might obey the law. Sometimes people, the way they put it, and I think this is a distinction from Ras, that they comply with the law when they, kind of conform to the law simply because the law says so, and they kind of act out of the law's authority. So that on the one hand, and then there's this sort of mere conformity, which is where you do as the law says, but you don't do it from the law, if you like, or in respect of the authority of the law, or out of respect for the authority of the law, but simply because you're afraid of the consequences. Bad things are going to happen to you, and that's why, that's why you obey. So again, and that's a picture that will tell you quite clearly what's wrong what's gone wrong here, right? Because that's precisely what Count Mirabeau is telling the king. We're going to do as the law says, assuming what the king says is law, but only because we're afraid of being bayoneted. But then, so that seems to be sort of a quite compelling picture of what's going along here. My initial motivation was to see how this point, sort of that kind of point, that the idea that there's something problematic about mere conformity on the one hand, and so that on the one hand, again, that being captured quite well by the Hard-Ross picture. On the one hand, on the other hand, with an idea that I also find compelling that I draw from Kant, which is that the law's first concern isn't with people's inner motivation, but just with their external actions. And within the Kantian framework, that's sort of what defines one of the two branches of morality. So the branch of morality that he calls right. So right is just defined by a sort of lack of concern with incentive, as Kant puts it. And so how do these two fit together? But in the process of thinking through this problem, it occurred to me that it might be the Hart view that I just described, where you have these two tiers of motivation. On the one hand, the proper legal motivation acting from law, and then on the other hand, the thing that's sort of secondary, if you like, namely acting from coercion, out of fear of coercion, might be more puzzling than it seems in the first place. So again, I've described these sort of two tiers of motivation, and Hart, that's sort of what the second quote on the handout gets at. There's a sense in which, so what Hart wants to say, well, again, the primary motivation is just acting from law, but then the law provides a kind of backup plan, right? When people don't act from the authority of the law, out of respect for the law, then coercion comes in. And Hart calls this a pis-aller, which I thought fits nicely with that French kind of, because it's French, so the open kind of counting without both things fits nicely together. But in any case, that's the expression he uses. And again, that seems quite compelling. Again, you think, okay, so first motivation, authority, second backup motivation, backstop, if you will, coercion. The trouble is that it's not clear. What seems puzzling, again, at second sight, to me at least, is what these two have to do with one another, and how, in what sense, the second thing is a second best, but yet the sort of thing that the law is internally concerned with. And the way I try to describe the problem in the paper is by analogy to Strawson's discussion of the reactive attitudes. So the idea was the following. What the reactive attitudes are about, according to Strawson, so things like resentment, blame, gratitude, guilt, they're a reaction to, a person's good or ill will towards one, right? So they pick up on what is expressed in what the other person does. And so what follows is that, the same sort of external action might warrant very different kinds of reactive attitudes depending on what motivated it, right? So if I step on your foot as kind of by accident, right, it would be strange or kind of excessive for you to resent me for that, right? Maybe I wasn't careful enough. Maybe there's ways of making it out that's appropriate, but in principle, if that's purely by accident, if I'm not if it's innocent, then it seems like you shouldn't resent me for that. It's very different if I just don't care about your physical well-being. And by the same token, if you do step around my foot and you avoid my foot, but only because I threaten, I would punch you in the face if you did that, right? Then it seems like that wouldn't be occasion for you to, that would be no occasion for you to not feel resentment towards me. If the only reason he's not stepping on my foot is because, it's the threat, because he fears that it's going to be bad for him, and it's no concern whatsoever with me, then it seems like, it's just as appropriate to feel kind of resentment towards that person. Now carry that back to the law. Now if the law, and this is sort of you get out of the Hart picture, if the law really what the law cares about is its authority over you. If it's sort of internal to the law that it, if you like, wants to have authority over you, it wants you to do what the law says because the law says so, right? Then it's not clear that there's that mere conformity is what mere conformity is supposed to do here, right? Why it isn't the case that mere conformity is neither here nor there? In the same way that my stepping on your foot or avoiding to step on your foot merely because I fear your retaliation is neither here nor there for the effect of for the purpose of the reactive attitudes you might feel towards me. Now that's not to say that you don't. That's not to claim that you may not prefer my not stepping on your foot on extraneous grounds, right? You might just have an independent concern with your physical integrity, but it won't do anything as far as our relation to one another. My not stepping on your foot just because I'm afraid of you're harming me in return isn't going to do anything for that, right? And so there's sort of two separate. The purpose that will be served by my not stepping on your foot just because I'm afraid of your retaliation serves a completely separate purpose from my not stepping on your foot. It sort of satisfies a very different kind of need of yours than the purpose of my not stepping on your foot out of respect for you, right? The one has to do with my respecting our relation to another. The other has to do with your mere physical integrity. And so the second isn't going to be like a second best to the first, so it's unclear. I want to raise it more as a question. It's not clear how the second is supposed to be second best to the first. And again, I think the same worry applies to the law. So again, this is sort of the puzzle I stumbled over as I was working through these materials. It's not quite clear how it fits in with the rest, but I do have this hunch that it's related. Okay, so now I want to have a kind of relatively abrupt shift, which also was in the paper, very abrupt, again, a function of the rush job. Switching over to Kant, to this idea of Kant's that I mentioned earlier on, that there's no the law, the right doesn't concern itself with motive. So you might think for Kant, that in a sense provides a very quick answer to the puzzle that I just laid out. If you're not even concerned with compliance, right? If there's not even if right as such isn't concerned with compliance, with motive in conformity, then there's also no puzzle. It seems like Kant just sidesteps the puzzle that I was just talking about, because as far as on that picture, as far as the law is concerned, juridical law. It isn't even acting merely out of fear of coercion isn't even a second best. It's just it's not second to anything. It's just the only thing it sort of concerns itself with. So there seems to be a quick on that picture. You seem to be just sort of scot-free, if you like. You seem to have sidestepped that kind of that puzzle altogether. But then on reflection, it occurred to me that maybe there's a separate problem that might turn out, and that's sort of where I'm stuck still a little bit around, not sure about, I certainly haven't tied things together properly, where there's a separate puzzle that might arise within the Kant, so that's really internal to the Kantian framework. And that's the following. For Kant, the law is still supposed to obviously be a law. And what that means is that it's supposed to, in some sense, bind categorically. The trouble is how to make sense of that thought in combination with the idea that the law doesn't concern itself with motive. And the reason is that the only way in which the law might any binding that's not sort of internal to the law, on Kant's view, can't be anything that binds categorically. Everything that's not sort of any purely external motive to comply with the law will bind to the law only hypothetically. It binds to the law. It says the thought is something like it'll have to have the form of, if you don't like punishment or something, then do as the law says, right? But that is just the form of a hypothetical imperative, right? It's just the if-then form that's characteristic of the hypothetical imperative. But Kant wants to claim that the law, Kant does claim that the law binds categorically. Some authors, so this puzzle has been noted in the literature. Marcus Wilczek and Alan Wood have both made reference to it. Marcus Wilczek talks about it more extensively, and so I have a kind of longer quote on the handout from him. But essentially, what Wilczek is arguing is that there isn't the law on Kant's view, juridical law, isn't supposed to bind at all, really. It has no. It's not. So he says it can't bind categorically because categorical binding would require an internal incentive, would require appeal to an internal incentive. It's certainly also not supposed to act as a hypothetical imperative, and so it's really not an imperative at all. It's just what it is. All it says is that when you're under an obligation, then other people are entitled to coerce you. And here's sort of the first time that I mentioned the term coercion. And so that's all there is to it. And now the interpretive trouble is that this flies in the face of what Kant says about juridical law, namely that it does give rise to obligations. It's not merely, it's supposed to have obligatory force. And so I was wondering how to bring these two thoughts together. So in a sense, the puzzle is, to put it sort of in one sentence, that is internal to Kant, is how law could on the one hand bind categorically and at the same time not concern itself with the kind of motive that would explain, that at least in ethics explains sort of the idea of a categorical imperative or categorical obligation, namely respect for law. So on the one hand, you want to have the idea that the law binds categorically. On the other hand, there's no appeal to the idea of motive. The motive he seems to be concerned with is purely hypothetical. How do these two things go together? That's sort of the puzzle I ended up with there. And the thought was, so this is sort of tenuous, I guess, but my thought was that if there's a way to answer that puzzle within the Kantian framework, then there might be a way that maybe that solution carries over to the puzzle with which I started out with in the paper, namely the puzzle how mere coercion might be a second best. Again, this is more suspicion than a fully worked out argument. The way I try to answer this problem the suggestion that I'm offering in the paper is a certain interpretation of Kant, where the starting point is that for Kant, any kind of obligation has to in some sense relate to a person's freedom. The only way in which there could be such a thing as obligation or categorical necessity, practical necessity, is by appeal, by some, it has to derive from freedom. Has to be internally related to freedom. Because anything else would be sort of purely hypothetical motivation, would be just motivation by self-love, wouldn't be sort of couldn't motivate principally or non-accidentally, but would only motivate hypothetically, contingently, whenever, would motivate to conform with the law only whenever it's the case that it serves a contingent interest, or that the only is contingent related. It always has to do with a kind of free self-imposition of the law. And my suggestion in the paper was that in the case of right, it's not the freedom of the person who is under the obligation itself that's at play, but it's the freedom of the other people that sort of with whom this person interacts in space and time. So I'm appealing in this reading. I'm appealing to what's the third quote on the handout, which says what Kant says there, and I want to pick up two of the. He says three things about the concept of right, and I want to pick up the first and the third. The first says the thing that I've been discussing, so that I've mentioned before, namely that right only has to do with external and practical, what he calls the external relation of one person on another. So, one person, the external relation between two people, so they're external actions. There's no concern with internal motive in right. And then the third thing he says is, and so what you get out of this is, the first, it's only external. It only has to do with external actions. There's no appeal to motive. The second is that it's relational. The law is supposed to have a relation. It always concerns relations between people. There's no such thing as juridical law, sort of in a relation between, sort of in an intrapersonal relation, which is different from ethics, where ethics has to do with how, in a sense, how we relate to one another, whether our, in Kant's terminology, our sort of rational self governs our merely sensible self. But now the third point. So he says, in this reciprocal relation of choice, no account at all is taken of the matter of choice, that is, of the end each has in mind with the object he wants. All that is in question is the form of the relation of choice on the part of both, insofar as choice is regarded merely as free. So I'm sort of picking up on that thought, and the idea again is that what explains why you're bound categorically by juridical law, why it poses a categorical imperative for you, is not because there's your noumenal rational freedom inner freedom at play, but because it's the external freedom, because the law represents the external freedom of other people. And in order to do that, in order to represent or order to embody other people's freedom against you, again it's relational, it has to be coercive, in Kant's view. The reason is that external freedom is supposed to constitute our mutual independence from one another. What does that mean? It means that sort of my choice doesn't determine yours. My will, if you like, doesn't determine yours, and vice versa. Now, suppose there were laws. You had certain rights against me, and I had corresponding correlative duties towards you, and yet it would be sort of independent of there wouldn't be any coercion in play. It would be it would be separated from coercion. Then whether I, respect your rights would be just a function of whether it would be up to me, right? Because nothing would keep me from infringing on your rights. So you would be dependent on my goodwill, if you like, and vice versa. And then, in a sense, your independence would be secured through a form of dependency. There's a kind of contradiction there. And so that's why Kant thinks, and I have this is the sixth quote, where he speaks of, he says there's a kind of there would be a contradiction involved if freedom didn't have its flip side coercion. And yet, and this is where it sort of ties back to the idea of freedom. It's not coercion that has just to do with the protection of certain particular ends you might have, right? But it has to do with, your freedom of choice more generally, your purely formal freedom of choice. So to kind of put it more concretely, in general, when you have a right to something, say you have a right in an object, right? You have a certain piece of property, then that protects, protects, not just a particular use of that property, that piece of property, but protects the property more. You can use it for whatever purposes you see fit. Of course, within certain limits, limits that are set by my rights, say, or that might be set by limits that might be set by the kind of public law in general, like say the tax law for one instance. But in principle, it's not. The idea of property doesn't tie you to a particular purpose, but it gives you a kind of freedom. So that was sort of the idea is that we have to understand the categorical nature of juridical law by appeal to freedom. There's no other way to make sense of it in the Kantian system, but again by appeal to other people's freedom. So from that perspective, the mistake or sort of the problem with this first picture is the first picture I mentioned, kind of the heart picture, the coercion as pis-aller, where there's the primary motivation is acting from law, and then the only secondary motivation is acting in accordance with law, but maybe from coercion or something. Is that in a sense it imports ethical ideas into right. This whole distinction between acting from law and acting in accordance with law is just at home within Kant's framework, within the ethics, not within right. So it's sort of an illegitimate extension of ethical concepts into right. And this provides for sort of an interesting flip of certain ideas. And that's sort of, I guess, that's sort of an interesting upshot, which is that what counts as accidental in ethics counts as precisely as non-accidental or principled in right and vice versa. So what do I mean by that? In ethics, any conformity with law that originates from self-love, from your sensible motives, it doesn't originate from respect for law, has to be viewed as purely you conforming to the law purely accidentally in some sense, right? And and the only sort of non-accidental conformity with law in ethics is with the right motivation, right? And again, in a sense, that applies one-to-one to that picture. That provides the whole distinction between accidentality and non-accidentality provides for one way of describing the what the pis-aller, this claim that coercion is a mere pis-aller, gets at. You might say, well, what the law wants is sort of compliance understood as non-accidental conformity, right? It wants conformity to the law, but not by accident, but from principle, if you like. And it's not happy or only partially happy, somewhat happy with accidental conformity. And then the puzzle was, well, what do those two have to do with each other, such that it's only partial happiness but yet happiness. Okay, but within right for Kant, and so this applies to ethics for Kant, but within right, conformity from respect for law, so compliance in the ethical sense, counts precisely as accidental, right? Because it's based purely on your private motivation. Private motivation in the sense of right. So what counts as the public motivation in ethics, namely respect for law, right? The motivation that allows for universality, that satisfies the categorical imperative. The very thing that counts as public motivation in that context counts as private motivation in the context of right. Whereas in the context of right, coercion embodies other people's, is kind of the effective embodiment of other people's freedom in space and time. And so if you comply sort of from coercion, coercion provides a kind of public motive in the context of right, whereas acting from coercion in the context of ethics would count as a kind of purely private motivation. So again, it's just another way of elaborating on the point that for Kant, what's going on with the kind of heart picture, the way he would criticize it, or might criticize from the Kantian point of view, is just by is sort of as a way of treating as an ethical problem, or I think as an ethical phenomenon, which is something that's really its own, that forms its own branch of morality. And so, in closing, I haven't said much. I mean, there's a large literature coercion that I've not addressed at all. But I guess one thing I do want to say is that it's I hope that this is a kind of starting point for looking at coercion, or giving a picture of coercion, in the sense that it provides for a sort of interpretation of the empirical phenomena. I think that's in general, that's a lot of times what I think what Kant is trying to do. He's trying to provide for a kind of rational structure through which to interpret empirical phenomena. And so what I'm thinking is, what we're getting out of this is a certain way of interpreting something that from one perspective looks like purely sort of what Kant calls pathological, or purely kind of sensible, or purely hypothetical manipulation. Namely, people doing things only because they're afraid of the consequences, right? That's, again, ethically speaking, that's just heteronymous. That's sort of the bad way of doing things. But when right provides for perspective on that, on which it appears to be a kind of, it's an embodiment of freedom, but of a very different kind of freedom than what we get from ethics. Okay, I will close here.
Thank you very much. And then we have Sebastian Lewis here from Oxford, and he's going to have comments and possibly questions on the paper. Sebastian.
Thanks, Tiny. Thanks, Micha, for this paper. I thought it was very challenging, to be honest. It's challenging and it's original, and I think it's promising in the sense that you might shed light on the debate of conformity and compliance, and whether we are in a binary situation of black and white, like the law wants you to act on the reasons the law gives you, or the law is happy with you acting on other kind of reasons, so long as you perform the action the law eventually wants you to perform. I have little comments that I would like to bring up as I go, because I have one sort of structural comment, which is it starts from the content side of the paper, and I take it that you want to try to put Kant in a position where he can be consistent with his own ideas, mainly that law, including juridical law, can bind not hypothetically, but under the form of a categorical imperative. And that poses a major interpretative challenge, as you say, because how do we account of this on the one hand, but then the fact that every law giving has two elements, which one is the law, meaning an object which is represented subjectively necessary, but on the other one, this incentive, which is in the ethical side, pure respect from law, or pure respect of the law, and therefore it's internal. But when it goes to juridical, it's pathological, meaning we need some kind of sensible phenomena out there just to be able to account for this. And right, how do we move forward with these two things here? And I try to focus all my study of the paper in basically 2 pages, where you try to really get the thing from here, which are, if you go to the paper, pages 13 to 16. And my real worry is whether the switch you make from changing sort of the nature of the incentive in juridical law would lead you to a compliant-based view of even juridical law. Let me explain myself. So the thought is the following: if you want the incentive to be an incentive categorically speaking, meaning we act just for the sake of this action and not for other kind of reasons, and you base that on this very intelligent, by the way, interpreted discovery, which is everything that binds categorically must start from freedom. And so you base this claim on the form rather than the matter. But as you make that move, my worry is this embodiment that you try to defend at the end, that will give you the categorically form of the incentive. When you make that, I fear that what you're giving up is what Kant does not want you to give up, which is basically this external thing, which can lead you to a collapse of the ethical and the juridical. So if the incentive is just respect for the form, and that form is the freedom of everyone here under a universal law, then I don't see how that respect cannot lead from within the person. And so it's not juridical but ethical law giving. And so this is, one way or another, you can have the Kantian structure of right and ethics totally undermined through this move of changing the nature of the incentive from external pathological to something that comes from within, although you want to say that it's external and it embodies the freedom of everyone, but that embodiment puts you or sort of affects a sort of normative force on you. And by the way, so that's like the main comment, and I have a couple of others. From that, right, I wonder if you can explain more about this nature of the embodiment, because in particular I wonder whether it gives you any kind of guidance. Because if you say, look, this embodiment is just, or we can explain coercion out of this embodiment, then we can account for conformity and all this stuff that's going on here, then my question is, do you get any kind of real guidance from the embodiment of others' freedom and will into your actions? And that could give you a clue to the kind of authority that you're looking at. So I said at the beginning that all this might lead you to a compliant base of law, in the sense that, right, if it is from external, you switch it to internal, then your reasons to comply with the law are just a categorical imperative, and that seems compliance, not conformity. And I wonder whether you at the end defend a compliant based or a conformity one, because the natural thought that I have here is, by the way, I don't have any kind of final thoughts on this at all, but at least I try to be skeptical on compliance, in the sense that whenever I think on a very simple light about whether law wants compliance or conformity, for instance, I ask myself, like, if the law requires you to pay taxes, for instance, which are the kind of reasons that you have to pay the taxes? Just a statute saying, Article 1, every person shall pay taxes, or you have other kind of motivations, to pay the taxes other than just that the law told you so. Just put part of your share so that other people can have access and so forth. So the thought is that compliance seems a very difficult account to defend. I'm not defending conformity on the other hand. But it seems to me that you wanted to put some moral value, or try to rescue conformity, the moral value of conformity, from this bis aller or second best. But I'm not sure if you end up defending a compliance base of law. That's it.
To give some responses.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. I think those are. I'm grateful, because I think they give me the opportunity to try and make some things clear that might not have been clear in the paper, and probably also weren't clear now. So because I sort of want to disagree with a lot of what you said, but you're putting the finger on the right point as far as I'm concerned. So what I want to say is that the way I try to set up the puzzle for Kant is, I want to say, so how can you understand? Or backtrack real quick. One way of framing this relates to this idea of accidentality and non-accidentality, is that if the incentive in Kant's ethics, the problem is that there's a kind of formal mismatch between the law. If you apply sort of if you merely conform to the moral law in the way that the prudent merchant in the example in the groundwork, where the prudent merchant doesn't cheat his customers, right? But he only does it because it's bad. It would be bad for business, right? And the trouble is, and again, you can see the accidentality here, right? Were it good for business to cheat the customers, were it profit maximizing to do that, then he would do it, right? So it's a sheer accident as far as, in a sense, it's a sheer accident that the conformity, the not cheating the customers, is a sheer accident. And one way of putting the point is that there's a kind of mismatch between what the law says and sort of the incentive, if you like, that's operating in the prudent merchant, right? Because the law has a kind of places a categorical demand on you. The law itself, the internal structure of the law qua law isn't, well, if you, if profit is being maximized, then, right? Or, but it says, don't cheat, right? And yet, the motivation is sort of hypothetical, if you like, purely accidental, right? And so, one way of seeing Kant's argument in the ethics is to think, to note that what he's looking for is a kind of incentive that matches the categorical nature of the law. And he thinks the only incentive that works, that has the right sort of formal shape, is the incentive of respect for law, and so an incentive that's internal to law itself. And now the problem that, and then the whole groundwork, if you like, the kind of, the groundwork and the critique of practical reason, what they're about is really to explain how that's possible, how there could be such a thing as being motivated by an incentive internal to law, and there you have to appeal to the idea of freedom. And so, okay, now switching over to right, the idea is now we assume that the incentive is external to law, right? And so from the ethics we're going to think, well, then it's got to be sort of a formal mismatch to law itself, right? And so the problem that Wright poses is to understand how it could be, on the one hand, external, and at the same time not be a mismatch, i.e. still bind categorically. And my idea was, in a way, maybe this makes it clear. So the thought is your worry is sort of on point, because it's sort of a how possible question that, where it's tempting to think, well, maybe it's not possible, right? And then it would really collapse. Then we'd be collapsing back into something like the view that only respect for law could provide a kind of incentive that binds categorically. And so my idea was, well, how could you have those two things? And the idea is sort of coercion, if you like. And I didn't say this clearly here. I say it a bit more clearly in the paper, maybe. But the idea is that coercion is, if you like, the name, or at least coercion within the context of law is the name, sort of is the concept that's supposed to refer to that sort of thing, right? An incentive that binds externally, it's not a matter of respect for law, and yet has the right formal shape, namely the shape of categoricity. And there, I think, for Kant, the only way that it could be had, in a sense, has to be a move parallel from the one that we get in the ethics, namely that only freedom will do. But it's not the freedom of the agent itself, it has to be it's another kind of freedom that comes in. A, external freedom, and B, so it's the freedom of other people. Now, I don't know if that addresses. maybe this is just a redescription of what I'm trying to accomplish, or what I take it Kant wants to accomplish, but this is sort of just, in a way, saying, yes, you're putting your finger on exactly the right spot. But that's precisely what Kant wants to avoid, the kind of sliding back into a kind of, the collapse of right into ethics in the last resort. Okay, so you were asking about what guidance for action the law provides on that picture. If you know, so
on the embodiment picture.
On the picture, what do you mean by the embodiment picture? On the picture where coercion is supposed to
be the embodiment of other external
right.
freedom.
So I take it that. So I think in a way that we're Kant would say, or the way I read it is that he would have to say that we're dealing, that in a sense this question is out of place within right. Well, but that's not the entire answer. I think so the first answer would be the question is out of place in right because right isn't concerned with guiding people, but what's guiding people, because guidance has to do with people's incentives, and people's incentives are sort of outside the purview of right. So the law for all the law cares, it sort of it sort of doesn't provide guidance. But maybe that's the wrong answer actually. Maybe the thought would have to be it's coercion that's providing the guidance, right?
And coercion is the embodiment, because that gives the point to Willerscheid, for instance, that tells for Kant.
Well, coercion just says, if this bad things are going to happen to you when you don't comply, when you don't conform to the law, you will be, there will be bad consequences, right? That's precisely not. So that's the incentive that. So the action guidance that you get from the law itself just is coercion, but acting from coercion is not acting from respect for law, I take it. And then you were saying something about, I think you were asking about the moral worth of, the idea was, well, how could sort of action merely in conformity with law have moral worth? In a sense, again, that's not going to be Kant's concern, because he would readily say that action merely done from coercion is morally worthless, has moral worth, because moral worth is sort of a question of ethics. But here's something that I would add, sort of by way of concession. The law still is the law, and by that, what I mean is it's the sort of thing on which you could act from respect for law. You could not possibly. So it's sort of part of the nature of even juridical law is that it is law, that it has kind of categorical shape, and so it's a sort of thing from which you could act, or that you could conform with out of respect for law. And so in that sense, it provides for the possibility, it's part of the nature of even juridical law that it provides for the possibility of ethically, sort of action that has ethical worth. Self-love could not do that, right? Because it doesn't have the shape of law. So in that sense, part of the nature of juridical law is that it provides for the possibility of action that has ethical worth. That would be. Does that make sense? But that's still a question.
I wonder.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, sure.
I wonder how does that fit with the picture where juridical law is not concerned at all with motivation, and hence I don't think Kant sees any moral value on juridical law. That's the worry at the end.
Right. Right. Well, so you can see how it doesn't have ethical value for him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, well, maybe you could, maybe you could say, well, it has a certain kind of juridical value simply in virtue of its being in conformity with law, right? So it's not breaking the law. So that would but it certainly wouldn't have the kind of value it has, acting from law has. And so, but what I was trying to say just now is, it's still part of the nature of juridical law that it provides for the possibility of valuable action of that sort, action that has kind of ethical value. I fear that I didn't answer the question properly.
Any more responses?
I'm not sure if I want to continue pushing on this point, because I think that there might be other things we could talk about. Like, could you say a word, for instance, on how do you the publicity thing of the name public? Where does it come from?
Okay, so what I would want to say is that the term publicity is going to take on very different meanings in the two contexts. So with ethics, what's going to count as public for Kant is just acting from respect for law. I mean, this is sort of in the idea of the categorical imperative as, having to do with the universalizability of your actions. If you just act from, out of your own interest, out of selfish, that's sort of a purely private motive. Now, I take it that coercion provides a public motive, or that's the thought I'm trying to spell out. I'm not sure I'm all the way there yet, but what I'm trying to spell out is that the idea that coercion provides a motive that's public, but in a very different sense of public. And in a sense of public on which the question whether you are motivated by respect for law, right? Whether you just do what the law says because the law says so, is really going to turn out to be kind of private for that purpose. So the first thing that you might notice that in a sense, and I think this is a completely intuitive thought when you when you just look at what the law does, right? Part of what it is to have a right is that, at least sort of in the context of an ordinary legal system, that it really doesn't matter whether other people like it that you have that right or not, right? The idea is that whether your security and your right is not a function of how other people feel about it, but it's a function of, but you can get it enforced against them, right? That's just part. I take it that's part of the idea of the juridical. It's not an idea that's sort of obscure or somehow idiosyncratic to Kant, but that's part of how we think of what it is to have, at least certain kinds of rights. So you can see a kind of publicity at work there. If there's a kind of there's publicity in the sense that there's no concern with what sort of, if you like, what's inside the mind of that. There's no concern with the motivation on the other end. But you can kind of be silent on that. It's enough that you have the kind of force of the law standing behind you, instating on your rights. And so that was the thought. There's a form of kind of abstraction from private. There's publicity. There's maybe a negative form of publicity. I mean, the term negative and positive are kind of appropriate here in a Kantian context because he distinguishes negative liberty from positive liberty. So in the case of acting out of respect for law, you can speak of a kind of positive publicity. Right? So you're positively motivated by the universalizability of your action. Whereas in the case of coercion, there's publicity in the merely abstractive or negative sense that there's no dependence on any kind of, it doesn't matter how the others feel about it, right? Sort of there's a kind of force may or may not provide it, but it sort of provides a kind of backstop motive, if you like, that acts, that overrides or that kind of constrains their whatever private motives they might have. And that is the sort of publicity that's appropriate to right as opposed to ethics. So in that sense, so I guess the larger picture here is that the complaint both against the Pis-Aller picture and some of what Villachek and Wood are doing is, I think they just in the first case there's a kind of import of ethical concepts into right. In the second case, they can't really. It's the same problem more by default, because they think they can't envision a purely kind of juridical incentive, then they think there can't be an obligation at all, because any obligation would have to provide an incentive. And since the only incentive that's available is sort of the pathological, hypothetical incentive, so the law can't be obligating at all. And I want to say no, there is a kind of public incentive, kind of categorical incentive, but the form of publicity and categoricity is one that's appropriate, that's proper, unique to right, as opposed to ethics. And they're just looking to ethics and saying, oh, it's not that, oh, so it's nothing. And I want to say, no, it's not that, but it doesn't mean it's nothing. I don't know.